Thanks so much, Fern. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. It's a beautiful afternoon where I am as well. So as Fern mentioned, I'm doing a PhD with Behaviours Australia, part of the Monash Sustainable Development Institute. And it's a graduate research industry partnership, so it's a partnership with DELP. And I'm specifically looking at Biodiversity 2037, the bio plan and the Victorians Value Nature goal, which I'll talk about a little bit more as we go along. But what I'm going to talk about today, to give you a bit of an overview, is some of the main threats to biodiversity loss and how human behaviour ties into that. We'll then look at some of the traditional behaviour change approaches that are often used by governments and why they often don't work. And then stepping into some of the factors that influence behaviour to get an idea of the complexity of humans and why we do what we do. And then I'll give you a very quick overview on some practical steps for designing some behaviour change interventions for biodiversity. So what exactly is the problem? These are some of the biggest threats to biodiversity loss across the world. In Australia particularly, habitat loss and deforestation is a particularly big problem. Australia has one of the highest rates of deforestation in the world. And we also have one of the highest rates of mammal extinction in the world. So biodiversity loss is a big problem here as much as it is for other countries. But if we look at these threats to biodiversity loss, all of them relate in some way, shape or form to human behaviour. Now, human behaviour at the system level, but also at the level of the individual. And to give you an example of consumption, or as we often experience in the West, overconsumption, some of the consequences of our overconsumption are things like habitat loss and degradation and exploitation of resources. Now, our systems are in place that encourage these kinds of behaviours. So capitalism and our cycle of perpetual growth actually encourage and support and reinforce overconsumption as a way of maintaining the system. But it also happens at an individual level, and we're experiencing this at the moment in the middle of COVID-19. So toilet paper, our individual behaviours around wanting to buy things like toilet paper have seen a massive demand and empty shelves in the supermarkets. So yes, we live in a system that encourages overconsumption, but our individual behaviours also have an important role to play. Now, some of the traditional behaviour change approaches that are used by big business and by governments are listed here. So awareness campaigns, financial incentives, regulation. But there's reasons why these often don't work. So if we take the example of awareness campaigns, providing information for people is the first step. It's not the end point. We often work on the assumption that if only we gave people the information that they needed, they would see the error of their ways and they would do things differently. But that's not the case. One example where an awareness campaign might actually help is in biodiversity. So there was a study done a couple of years ago that asked people, what does biodiversity mean to you? And this was a Victorian study, and about 50% of respondents actually said they didn't know. So if we wanted to start raising awareness about biodiversity, we might start with a campaign that actually explains to people what biodiversity means. If we look at financial incentives, so financial incentives can often backfire. And an example comes from South Africa, where they introduced plastic bag bans. So they banned lightweight plastic bags and introduced a fee for the thicker bags. And they found that when they initially introduced the fee for the thicker bags, the rate of bag consumption actually went down, but there was also backfire about the amount that people had to pay. So they decreased the fee. But when they decreased the fee, the amount of plastic bag use went up again. So we talk about pay enough or don't pay at all. And with regulation, we can put rules in place and we can tell people what they need to do in terms of laws and policies, but we have issues around compliance and enforcement. If people are not actually complying with the regulations and they're not being enforced in some way, then the regulations are not particularly effective. And so, for example, if there was a regulation, I believe there's regulations around Murray cod, around we need fish to be a certain size in order to breed. So fishers have to throw back fish that are either too big or too small. But if there's no compliance and not enforced, then these regulations aren't going to be particularly effective. So often these behaviour change approaches don't work because human behaviour is incredibly complex, and we often need multiple levers, multiple ways of encouraging people to do things differently. And this is where behavioural science can help. So there are many, many factors that influence behaviour, and these 8 broad categories I could talk about for weeks. There are entire master's programs dedicated to understanding these different factors that influence behaviour. But to give you a bit of an idea about some of the complexity of human behaviour, I'll step you through these and give you an example from each category. So cognitive biases, lots and lots of research looking at particular biases in the way that we think. Loss aversion, for example, we don't like to lose more than we're happy to gain. If we're giving too many choices, we'll often get choice paralysis and just avoid making a decision altogether. But if we look specifically at the status quo, we tend to do what we've always done. And you can think of this yourself the last time you went to the supermarket. We tend to reach for the same brands, the same products. We tend to accept the existing state of affairs. And so we can use this to encourage behaviour change by using default settings and getting people to opt out rather than opt in. An example might be if we want people to use less paper. We can set the printing settings to default to double-sided, and there's actually been some research looking at this. People will often not bother to change it back to single-sided printing and will automatically use a lot less paper. Social influences is a big one. So we are social creatures. We are influenced by each other much more than most of us would believe. There are 2 types of social norms that we talk about. One is a descriptive norm, so everyone does it. And one is a prescriptive norm, what should be done. So this is kind of the moral norm. And we can inadvertently reinforce the undesired behaviour by describing the extent of the problem. And the example might be, say, disposable coffee cups. By saying, wow, look how many disposable coffee cups are ending up in landfill, we're actually reinforcing that disposable coffee cups is actually the default behaviour. So if we wanted to use this to change behaviour in a biodiversity context, say, for example, farmers who fence remnant vegetation, we could set up a campaign that talks about a social norm. So we could send out flyers to tell farmers, well, everyone in the district is doing it, or this is the morally right thing for you to do. And then we're going to have a much better chance of influencing that farmer's behaviour. Lots of different factors within attitudes. So our beliefs, our values, our political worldviews. We talk about the value action gap, so what I say versus what I do. There's a lot of research in this area, but I won't go into it now. But from a belief perspective, again, if we come to farmers, if farmers...
Sorry, Melissa, can I just drop in for a second? We're picking up an issue with the microphone dropping in and out. Would you be able, have you got the headphones on?
Yes, I do, and a microphone right in front of my face.
Okay. If you can hold the microphone any closer, it might be a threshold issue. So it might be detecting a drop in threshold between sentences and then cutting back in. So if it's a little bit closer, maybe that won't happen, but we'll give it a go and continue. Thank you. Sorry.
All right, no worries, Andy. I'll try to hold it closer and I'll see how I go.
Thanks.
So where to get to? Beliefs. So beliefs about revegetating riparian areas, so farmers that have waterways that need protecting. If a farmer doesn't believe that revegetating will make a difference, or they don't think it's their responsibility, they probably won't do that particular behaviour. So again, if we wanted to use a behaviour change intervention, we could highlight how important it is and the influencing the extent of responsibility for that farmer. Habits and routine are another big influence on our behaviour. A lot of what we do is automatic. We don't think about it. So you could think, again, the last time you drove to work when we were actually driving to work. You didn't have to think about where you drove to. You just got in the car and went. And so we do these things without even thinking a lot of the time. But disruptions to routine are often really good times to change habits. So there's been some research looking at when people move house or change jobs or get divorced or have a baby. These are all major life events that influence what we do and change our routine. So if, for example, we want to get someone to switch across to renewable energy, we could put a flyer in the letterbox of someone that's just moved house, encouraging them to switch across to renewables. And the recent bushfires were an example. We wrote a piece for The Conversation recently about people wanting to help after the bushfires. We were all affected in some way, shape or form by the smoke haze or the images online of the devastation. And so people were saying, I want to help. And we need to take the moment to actually of that habit disruption in order to change behaviours. But another one we're living through right now is our physical distancing, what we're living through with COVID-19. We are not driving anymore, we're not driving as far, we're not flying, we're all working at home. And so this is actually a prime opportunity for us to start thinking about, well, what habits do we want to change? What behaviours do we want to do differently when the physical distancing restrictions are removed? Emotions are another important element of behaviour change, and they can be an incredibly powerful hook for getting people interested and for actually doing something differently. And we all saw the images of the animals that were burned by the bushfires, and that arguably is a big contributing factor to people wanting to do something to help the wildlife. And in the work that I do in connecting people with nature, if we can encourage positive emotions when we spend time in nature. So if you think yourself of when you've looked at a beautiful sunset or climbed up a mountain and had that feeling of awe and wonder and joy and that wow kind of moment. These are moments that encourage positive emotions and really get us to connect with nature at a deeper level. And so these can be incredibly powerful ways of getting people to think about their connection and actually wanting to do things to protect nature. Now, capability, opportunity and context, I'm going to lump together just for the sake of simplicity. These relate to things like knowledge and awareness, information. Do I believe I can do something? Do I have access to the resources to do that behaviour? And is there a cost involved, and can I meet that cost? But when we're looking at capability, opportunity and context, the scale at which the issue is observed is also important. So whether we're looking at an individual behaviour, maybe a local behaviour within a district or a regional council, or at a global level. And to illustrate, if we think about pesticide use, if we want to reduce the amount of pesticides going into the environment, if we want to encourage backyard gardeners to stop using things like Roundup, we want to make sure that they have the knowledge and awareness of the problems of Roundup, why it's something that shouldn't be used. But we also want to make sure that they have available information around alternatives. Do they believe they can use alternatives? Do they have access to it? And are there costs involved? So if the costs of the alternative behaviours, of the alternative products are more, then that could potentially be a barrier to using alternatives. And if we're looking at a local scale, so say a regional council, for example, to stop using pesticides, the knowledge and awareness is going to be different to the individual, and costs and self-efficacy could potentially be as well. And at the global level, if we look at things like agribusiness, again, it's going to be a different level, a different set of knowledge, a different set of information, potentially a different set of self-efficacy and cost involved. So we need to think about the scale that we're talking about in terms of changing a particular behaviour. So to give you some real-world examples now of where these factors tie into behaviour change. A team over at RMIT at Icon Science published a paper a couple of years ago looking at message framing in terms of the benefits of private land conservation. And this was trying to get more landholders to actually participate in schemes like Land for Wildlife and Bush Tender. And they found that the message framing could be roughly divided into 3 value orientations. So biospheric is benefiting the environment, altruistic is the kind of social benefit, and egoistic is benefiting myself. And they found that most of the message framing around the benefits of private land conservation actually tapped into the biospheric values. So they were saying, do this because it's great for the environment. But we know that some landholders are actually driven by egoistic benefits. So they will improve their land. They'll engage in things like bush tender because it improves the value of the property. And so if we're not allowing some messages to at least be framed in the sense of those egoistic benefits, we're actually missing out on a potentially large chunk of landholders who would otherwise engage in private land conservation. And if we look at citizen science, some of the reasons why people choose to participate in citizen science. So pro-environmental attitudes is often a big one. People will do it because they believe in protecting the environment. Social norms as well. So if other people are doing it, they're also more likely to do it. And if we look at it from the sense of capability and opportunity, we know from some research that young adults are actually more likely to do citizen science that involve things like taking photos and uploading them to social media. Whereas older adults are more likely to do the more complex activities, which might be monitoring, taking samples, analysing samples, that kind of thing. And so if we can understand the different drivers of why different people participate in citizen science, we can tailor interventions to get different types of people more involved in these types of activities. And also when we look at the outcomes of participating in citizen science, so people will often report that their attitudes become even more pro-environmental once they've done citizen science, and they'll actually increase their conservation behaviours. So they often say, I've done it once, I'll do it again because I really enjoyed it. And so we can see there's a bit of a feedback loop between the attitude and the behaviour back to the attitude again. And a related set of activities, environmental volunteering. If we think of this in the context of the kind of work that land care groups will do, some of the drivers of why people choose to participate in environmental volunteering can be divided into those 3 value orientations that I mentioned earlier. So people will often do volunteering because they want to protect or restore natural areas, or they want to provide something for future generations. Some people say that they do it for a sense of place attachment. So, for example, they might decide to revegetate the creek running down behind their house because they enjoy looking out their back window and seeing the natural area restored. Some people do environmental volunteering for altruistic values. So they talk about doing it to give back, to set an example. Particularly older generations will report this. Some see it as helping others. Some other motivations, some other drivers of why people do environmental volunteering relates to more egoistic values, so things that benefit themselves. And so they will do it because it's social, or they feel good, or they get to do some physical activity. Some people do environmental volunteering because it helps with career development, particularly if they're wanting to move into an environmental type career. Some people do it because it's learning new skills. And so again, if we can understand some of the drivers of why people choose to do these particular activities, we can tailor interventions to target these specific value orientations to get more people involved in these activities. And again, like citizen science, you can see the outcomes of participating in environmental volunteering also highlight a feedback loop. So people who have done volunteering report more environmental knowledge and awareness. They will often also report more pro-environmental behaviours. So we often do these things because we have environmental value orientations, and then the behaviour actually reinforces those orientations and that knowledge. So to give you a bit of a rundown on my research and where it fits in all of this. As I mentioned in the beginning, I'm working on Biodiversity 2037, and specifically the Victorians Value Nature goal. I'm a psychologist, a social scientist, so I'm looking at how we can encourage more people to value nature, how we can encourage more people to think about it, to connect with it in order to do more things to protect it. And underlying the assumption of Victorians value nature is that if we connect people with nature, there will be more actions to protect biodiversity. And my PhD is basically picking this apart. It's looking at understanding this particular relationship and how we can use this idea of connecting people with nature in order to increase actions to protect biodiversity. Now, last year, there were 2 meta-analyses published within a couple of weeks of each other that actually looked at this relationship. And there was a moderate to strong positive relationship found across multiple studies showing that people who are more connected with nature do more to protect nature. So this is fantastic evidence for the bioplan to show that it's on track. So this idea of connection is a potentially useful means through which to get more people involved in conservation activities. And so my PhD is focusing now on connection with nature, on understanding connection. Now, there's about 20 years worth of research looking at this construct of connection with nature. Historically, it's been considered a fairly unidimensional, a fairly simplistic construct. So we're connected to nature or we're not, and then variations grading in between. But there's been some work done recently looking at it being a multidimensional construct. But in terms of measurement, social scientists tend to measure things with questionnaires, and the questionnaires that have come out so far have tended to be quite unidimensional. So I took some data, the data from the Victorians Valuing Nature Foundation survey that was done in 2018, and developed a brief but multidimensional questionnaire, which we've called the CN12, to measure connection with nature. And DELP are now using this across programs to as a bit of a benchmarking tool to work out levels of connection with nature across Victorians to try to meet that goal of 5 million Victorians being connected with nature by 2037. And the next part of my research is looking at how does connection with nature develop and how is it maintained? And there's actually a surprisingly little amount of research looking at this. We do know that amount of time that you spend in nature it seems to be important, and particularly childhood type experiences. So people that grew up running around forests and playing with sticks and rocks and climbing trees seem to have a stronger connection with nature as an adult. And so what I'm looking at is how different types of nature influence connection. So do we need to go out into wilderness or a national park, or can we spend time in our own backyard? And is that enough to influence connection? Can we go to, say, a zoo or a botanical garden, and how does that influence connection? I'm also looking at how spending time in actual nature, so actually being out in a forest or by a creek, compares to simulated nature, so watching a nature documentary or spending time in a natural history museum. I'm also looking at barriers to spending time in nature. So people will often report that they don't spend time in nature because they don't have access, or they don't have time, or they don't want to. So I'm looking at how do these barriers influence people actually, how do these barriers influence people's connection with nature? And the next part of my research will be looking at perceptions of nature. So in the VVN Foundation survey, we asked people what comes to mind when you think about nature. And some people talked about pristine wilderness and crystal clear flowing creeks. Others talked about green grass. Others talked about my favourite pot plant sitting on my desk at work. So I'm looking at how do these different perceptions of nature relate to connection? And can we get people to think about nature differently, particularly urban dwellers who may not have access to the Grampians, for example, to go out and connect with nature in a more wilderness setting? How can we use parks such as Edinburgh Gardens or their own backyards to connect them with nature in order to foster this sense of connection to hopefully then lead on to pro-environmental behaviours? But before we move on to the practical stuff, I just want to outline a few caveats to all of this. So changing behaviour is not easy. We humans inherently don't like change, and we can have all of the evidence in front of us and we still will not do the things that we need to do. If you think yourself about if you've ever tried to eat differently or start an exercise program, we know it's good for us, but we quite struggle sometimes to actually do it. And as we've just seen from these different drivers and these different factors that influence behaviour, human behaviour is incredibly complex. And when we look at the big issues like biodiversity loss and climate change, we have not evolved in a way that allows us to address these problems easily. So we as a species evolved running through the forests and escaping saber-toothed tigers. And so we're very good at dangers that are right in front of us, that are very obvious, that are very quickly appear, that are very short-term danger. But we're not very good at the problems that are more invisible or slow advancing or need longer term responses. And so in the context of biodiversity, most people are not even aware of what biodiversity loss looks like. So they're not able to respond in a way that's particularly helpful. It's not to say we can't change them, it just makes them a little bit more difficult to do. Another thing to remember is behavioural science is not a panacea. So we often talk about having a big influence on a small number of people or a small influence on a big number of people. And in the next section, I'll step through targeting particular audiences and particular behaviours. But for the purposes of this, it's useful to understand that one intervention is not going to change the behaviour of millions of people, or at least not to a great degree. And so we need to be quite mindful of where and how behavioural science is actually helpful in this context. And when we're looking at biodiversity behaviours, again, the Icon Science team over at RMIT published a paper a couple of years ago looking at biodiversity-specific behaviours and why there are a lot of difficulties in trying to address these behaviours. And they're often quite complex behaviours that involve multiple actors and lots of different behaviours and multiple processes. But also there's quite often a distance between the behaviour and the impact. So for example, if I choose to buy recycled paper, toilet paper, I don't get an immediate feedback that my decision to purchase that product is going to prevent X number of trees from being felled in some far off place. And so the distance between my behaviour and the impact of my behaviour is quite great. And again, that feedback loop is often lacking. So that again makes it quite difficult to change these specific types of behaviours. Now, to go through some practical steps if you are looking to develop a behaviour change intervention for a biodiversity type behaviour. Behaviour works use a process they call the method. Method. And this link here will actually take you to the webpage. It shows you in a lot of detail each of these steps, explaining them a bit more. So I'll just give you a quick overview now of how this sort of might work in practice. So the first part of the problem is understanding the bigger picture. So what's been tried before, what's the evidence, but also looking at identifying a specific target audience and a specific behaviour, and then prioritising the behaviour to focus on. Because quite often when we're looking at behaviours, we're looking at a group of behaviours. So for example, environmental volunteering is not a behaviour, it's a lot of different behaviours. And so we want to try to prioritise which behaviour to focus on. Now, in terms of target audience, different people will interpret and engage with a behaviour in different ways. And they will also perform the behaviour in different ways, and they'll look at different drivers and barriers. So for example, the environmental volunteering example we've been looking at, if we want to get more retirees involved, they may put different level of interpretation and engage with that behaviour differently to, say, young unemployed males or mums with young families. And so if we wanted to get more mums involved in environmental volunteering, we would need to look at the specific drivers and barriers for that target audience in order to tailor the intervention. And when we are able to segment the audience and to look at the specific target group of people whose behaviour we want to change, it can save us a lot of time and money. It can enable a tailored intervention, and it also increases the likelihood that behaviour will actually be changed. Next, after we've identified the audience, is to identify the actual behaviour. And to give you an example of how this might differ, if we look at picking up rubbish. And so if we wanted to get university students to participate in a cleanup event on campus during O Week, the behaviour change intervention might look quite different to if we wanted to get dog owners to take a bag with them when they walk their dog in the morning to pick up rubbish from their local creek. And that intervention might look different again from one to get campers to take their rubbish home with them when they leave a campsite. And so we need to understand the specific audience as well as the action and the target and the context and the time as well, so that we can really tailor that intervention. Once we've worked out what behaviour or behaviours to focus on, we then need to look at the impact of this and how likely it is to be adopted. This is a way of prioritising which behaviour to focus on. And this comes from the work of Sarah Kneebone, a colleague from Behaviourworks, published this a few years ago, looking at water-saving behaviours. And she was looking at the section in the top left here, the really hard but effective behaviours, might be really high impact on the behaviour, but very unlikely to be adopted. So these would require perhaps some kind of incentive to encourage this behaviour to happen. On the right-hand side, the easy and effective box, these are your low-hanging fruit. So any behaviours that are likely to have a very big impact on the issue and are also very likely to be adopted are where you would want to start. The two bottom boxes in the low impact on the issue would be probably not your place that you would actually target specific energy, at least not in the first instance. And to give you an example from Sarah's work, she looked specifically at water-saving behaviours, and in the top left-hand corner there you can see the high impact but low likelihood behaviours are the ones that by and large cost a lot of money. So installing a rainwater tank or a grey water system will save a lot of money, but there's also a lot of cost involved. And so if we wanted to get more people to do this behaviour, we would probably need to provide some kind of financial incentive to encourage that to happen. If we jump across to the right-hand side and look at the high impact and the high likelihood behaviour, so things like installing a low flow shower head, fairly cheap, but also will have a fairly high impact on water saving behaviour. So this again is your low hanging fruit. This is where you want to start your interventions. And this impact likelihood matrix was also applied in biodiversity. So last year, Matthew Selinsky from RMIT presented on prioritising human behaviour change conservation. And this workshop, the work that he led, was about prioritising which behaviours DELP can focus on to encourage biodiversity conservation within Victoria. And this has helped to highlight five behaviours that they're now focusing on in the How Victorians Can Act for Nature brochure that you see here. So once you've understood the big problem and got an idea of the target audience and the specific behaviour, we then want to do what we call a deep dive. And this is to really understand the behaviour itself, looking at things like theories of change, drivers and barriers, and to start thinking about what interventions we might put in place. Now, the deep dive is important for a few reasons, but primarily because the community or the general public is actually not a homogenous group. The drivers and the barriers can differ quite significantly depending on the audience. Basic demographics is often something that we segment people by, so by age or gender or cultural or social differences. And we also want to identify, is the target behaviour that we're trying to change actually relevant to that audience? Because if it's not, it's going to be much, much harder. To give you an example, this is from the Victorians Valuing Nature Foundation survey, looking at, we asked people some of the barriers to spending time in nature. And again, because we know that spending time in nature leads to connection with nature, which hopefully then leads to pro-environmental behaviours. And if we look at attitudes around, I don't like spending time in nature, men were actually more likely to endorse this question than women. And younger people more than older people, and metro people more than regional people. So if we wanted to get men to spend more time in nature, we would need to look into these barriers around, well, maybe they just don't like spending time in nature. So what's another way that we can potentially connect them to nature? If we look at a capability question, so I don't have time to get out into nature. Younger people were much more likely than older people to agree to this question, and metro people more than regional. So again, if we want to encourage more younger people to get out into nature, we would have a slightly different intervention, perhaps around perceptions of amount of time needed to get out into nature than we would for, say, older people. And from a social norms perspective, we know that if family and friends don't do something, then we are less likely to do that something. And so fewer of my family or friends spend time in nature. Younger people were more likely to agree to this than older people. So again, the intervention to try to get more people spending more time in nature would look different depending on age group. Now, there are times when the deep dive isn't possible for time or money. And so there are generic behaviour change tools that we can use to encourage behaviour change. And the Behavioural Insights team in the UK published what they call the EAST framework, which is a really neat, really simple package that you can use to change behaviour. So to make a behaviour easy, you want to look at things like the default settings, as I said before, or simplify the message. To make a behaviour attractive, you want to personalise the message. We're more likely to respond to something that's personally addressed to us than someone that's just addressed to a person in the public. And also the scarcity mindset. We are very drawn to things which we think there's not very much of. And again, coming back to our COVID supermarket situation, when there's no pasta on the shelves, we suddenly really want pasta. So we can make it much more attractive by using this scarcity mindset. We can also make a behaviour quite social. So again, social norms, everyone does it. Public commitments can actually work quite well too. So we know that if you agree and stand up in front of somebody and say, I'm going to do behaviour X, you're actually more likely to do that behaviour. And timely, we can use things like prompts. If we want to get people to recycle, for example, we can put a sign up on a bin that says, this is what goes in this bin. And we can also use the cost and benefit. So we're much more drawn by the current cost or benefit than something that may be a cost or benefit in the future. And so we can use these to increase the chances of a behaviour being changed. And the final step of this process is application. So we would always look at how are we going to know it's been successful. So we need some kind of monitoring and evaluation framework. Always do a pilot test first before we put it out into the big wide world. And we quite often need to evaluate and amend as required. So some of the take-home messages from today. First of all, human behaviour is incredibly complex, and very, very rarely does one intervention actually change behaviour. We often need multiple levers and multiple targets to change, to get people to do things differently. Behaviour is also very dependent on the actor, the context, and the specific behaviour itself. So we need to know the audience, the behaviour, and the context in order for our intervention to be as effective as possible. And historically, conservation has very rarely considered the role of human behaviour, which is just sort of highlighting, I guess, the silos that we see in government, in science, in academia. Interdisciplinary work is not as prolific as it should be. But as I said back in the beginning, some of the biggest threats to biodiversity loss relate to human behaviour. And so behavioural scientists and ecologists can and should be working together. By using behavioural insights, we can increase the likelihood that findings recommended by ecologists will actually be taken up and put into practice in the big wide world. And just before I finish up, if anyone's interested in doing some online foundations training in behaviour change, Behaviourworks have just released an online module that is available to all consortium partners, including staff at DELP. So these are the details here, and I'll make sure these are available to anyone who's interested in doing this module. References I will include as a separate document because there's 2 pages of it. If anyone's interested in any of the references and they can't access them, shoot me an email and I'm more than happy to send it across. And just in closing, I'd like to encourage you to think about in your own work that you do at DELP, who do you want to do what differently? And in the context of our current COVID-19 pandemic with habit disruption, what might you want to do differently? So thank you for listening and happy to field any questions.
Thank you so much, Melissa. That was a really enjoyable presentation. I think everyone found it quite enlightening, and it's also stimulated some questions online. But for those who do have a question and want to ask it in person, you can use the raise your hand feature in the questions area. If you want to raise your hand, I'll unmute you and you can ask a question and we can take turns doing that. But I'll first start off with just a question in the chat. From Mark, he's saying that there's clearly a lot of challenges for the planet coming from entrenched activities of adults. Can we engage young children and people to be effective early and build those connections and relationships with nature? And are there any useful emerging strategies from your research that can help build enduring connections for young people, i.e. effective environmental education?
Yes, and absolutely. And there's a lot of evidence looking at getting kids involved from a young age is actually much more effective than trying to get adults involved. Not to say that if an adult's never had experience of nature that they can't learn that later in life, but we do know that kids absolutely are a prime target. There's a lot of really great literature coming out of environmental education, and there's one paper in particular I can think of that I'm more than happy to shoot across to you that was actually looking at the different elements of kids that have experiences in nature, what kinds of things are important. And they know with kids, for example, having an opportunity, for example, to have that wow moment increases that connection and giving them an opportunity to explore independently. So our societies now tend to restrict kids in what they're allowed to do, but if we just kind of let them go and explore nature in a more free kind of manner, they tend to develop a much deeper connection with nature. And even things like having adult role models, having enough exposures to nature as a child, particularly at a young age. So yeah, there's a lot of really great literature out there looking at kids. And as I said, shoot me an email. I'm more than happy to share some of that.
Wonderful. Thanks, Melissa. There's a number of questions around the online course you mentioned from Behaviourworks and people from external agencies and not just DELP. Do they have access to that?
That's a very good question. I'll have to check. That email I only got a couple of days ago, and it said it was actually available to consortium partners with Behaviourworks. So they've said to encourage DELP staff to share this link widely. Outside of DELP, I'm not 100% sure. I will find out and let you know.
Awesome, thanks. And there's a few others around sharing the PowerPoint in this presentation. I'll send you those emails, and if we can, we'll share it to the rest of the attendees. There's a question. Perfect. There's a question from Stephen about people who live on quarter-acre blocks, whether they have greater connections with those living in townhouses and apartments, and if so, is their current planning scheme decreasing people's connections? So I guess this is around urban structures and the way we spatially distribute people in the landscape and their connections.
Yeah, well, I don't know an awful lot about the detail of that, but I do know, well, that's like a part of the research I'm looking at the moment, what kind of nature can we connect to and how much is important and what kind of dose. There's been some interesting papers come out of Brisbane in the last few years that have looked at nature dose, and people who have access to nature, so who have backyards or even a park nearby, don't actually necessarily spend time there. So they're now starting to realise that even just having access to nature is not necessarily enough to get people to connect to it. So there seems to be this idea of connection with nature as a construct that we're talking about seems to be a much stronger driver of people actually spending time in nature than merely having access to it. So part of what I'm looking at is to understand, you know, how do we get people who may not be connected to nature to think about nature in different ways, and whether that's being more mindful. There's been some really interesting research looking at mindfulness. If you actually do a 2-week study of consciously paying attention to the trees that you walk past on the street, that seems to increase. So yeah, again, there's some really interesting stuff coming out, but there's a lot of work being done in the urban planning area around this, and yeah, I can certainly forward some literature around that.
Awesome, thank you. We're going to try take a raised hand question. So Kate Forster, I hope you're ready. I'm going to unmute you now and hopefully you can speak.
Thanks very much, Melissa. This has been really interesting. Just wanted to bring up the issue of connection with nature also sometimes harming it. And I think concern that sometimes activities in parks and so on can be globalized into this, and this a positive thing without consideration for that impact. And a good example of that was Parks Victoria in 2008 approving the Oxfam Trail Walker in a nature conservation reserve, where that was clearly excluded, an excluded activity through the VAC recommendations accepted by the government. But Parks Victoria and DWELP would not back down from that position. So there's a number of aspects to that, but in particular, just this impact, we have it worldwide now on some walking trails where the damage that's occurring is significant.
Absolutely agree, and that's part of what I'm looking at in looking at the different types of nature, because as our populations grow, as our cities grow, there are more of us. And if the perception is we need to have wilderness in order to connect with nature, well, that's not an awful lot of wilderness for 9 going on 10 billion people. And so we need to look at other ways that we can connect with nature. And I absolutely agree in the issues around walking trails and damage. Another example is 4-wheel driving. And so paradoxically, people that do 4-wheel driving will actually say they're very connected to nature because they appreciate that they kind of need the forest in order to do the 4-wheel driving. But by virtue of that activity, they're actually causing a lot of damage to the environment. So yeah, I agree. There's a lot of considerations we need to have in that context, and some protected areas need to be protected. Absolutely, like if you look at Southwest Tasmania, to prevent people from going there, just so that those ecosystems can remain intact. And so that's again what I'm looking at, trying to work out: are there other ways that we can connect people with nature without necessarily having every member of population in Melbourne going to the 1,000 Steps in Dandenong?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Good question. I'm going to jump to Penny Richards. Hope you're ready as well. I'm unmuting you now. Penny, are you there? All right, we'll leave Penny for now and jump to Sarah Nichols. Sarah, can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Great. Go ahead.
Awesome. Hey, Andy. Hey, Melissa. Thanks for the great presentation. Melissa, I was wondering if you know of any really rapidly instigated research that's happening now on the impact of COVID-19 and connections to nature, whether that's creating a positive or negative connection. It seems to be quite an amazing opportunity. So I'm wondering if you know of anyone anywhere in the world jumping on board to find out more.
Sarah, that is a fabulous question and something I've been talking to Fern about over in the last week. Not that I'm aware of, but I'm not 100% up to date to what's come out in the last sort of 2-3 weeks. But I agree, I think it's a fantastic opportunity because, as you say, some people have now got time on their hands, some people don't. But we're in these situations where we're restricted. We both are limited in access to parks. Local parks have been closed, but a lot of people, I know myself, the creek that runs down behind my house, I've never seen so many people down there. There are, I think, incredible opportunities to think about in terms of how we connect. I'm also finding there's been a few interesting pieces in The Guardian recently about getting people involved in citizen science. And I know like parents, for example, are now doing bird watching and bird counts and frog counts as a way of entertaining the kids during lockdown. So I think I absolutely agree. I think there's a lot of opportunities there and research, if it's not being done, that needs to be done. So I agree. I'll keep my eyes open though and I'll let you know.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. Thank you.
Wonderful. I've just found Penny's question in the chat, and she was asking if there's been any evaluation on the department's summer interpretation programs, which aim to facilitate connection to nature using programs such as Earth Education. Are you familiar with that program, Melissa?
No, I'm not.
Okay.
You might have to do that one, Andy.
Okay, well, we'll pass this on and maybe Penny can enlighten us a bit more about that program and we can provide an answer a bit later on.
Okay.
Lots of questions. I'm just trying to search through another one. No, we've answered that one. Is there any early indications of the value of wilderness versus urban nature? Could there be implications of the value under urban nature protection laws? That's from Lee.
Coming from the VVN data, I haven't done that analysis yet. Give me a couple of weeks and I'll let you know.
That's awesome. Great. A lot of thank yous in there and more sharing ones. I think there's one question that I missed. There's a comment around emotional images such as the fire impacts being disengaging rather than engaging. Do you have any comments on whether or not positive imagery versus negative imagery is more effective in engaging people with nature?
There's some really interesting research in this space, and I actually had a much more detailed slide on this, but I cut it because I ran out of time. There is evidence that with environmental issues, people will often switch off because they get saturated. So we get kind of compassion fatigue, for example, and there was interesting research looking at this in the context of the floods that happened in Queensland in 2009, I think it was, to 2010, 11. People got compassion fatigue and they just switched off. And there's a lot of literature looking at this in the context of climate change. In that, yeah, the negative messaging can actually turn people away. It can also lead to a bit of that despair, and we know that denial and despair are quite often have very similar outcomes. And so, yeah, we need to be really conscious. It also ties into that idea of social norm. By highlighting the extent of the problem, we can actually inadvertently reinforce the behaviour. So my personal view, a lot of what I do in my psychology work is grounded in positive psychology. And so I'm a big fan of talking about positive stories, species that are recovering and positive things that are actually happening based on conservation efforts. I think that's equally as important as highlighting the negative stuff, the destruction that's actually happening as well.
Great, thank you. A question from Ben from the city of Melton. He's talking about private and rural landowners looking at their land, and in his work, he often struggles to articulate the science of behaviour change to supervisors, and often they believe creating a better brochure. I guess that one of the problems you're talking about at the start of your talk around information deficit disorder being the main thing. Do you have any information that you might be able to share with the audience about that? Like, how do we convince people that behaviour change is important, more than just informing people?
There's a couple of articles that I used that I drew from to put this presentation together, so I can certainly share those. They make a very compelling argument. Also, the Behavioural Insights team, the EAST framework that I mentioned, and I can certainly send you the link to that. That's a really great brochure that talks about that idea about a behaviour change intervention in a kind of a simple way. And I agree that having a simpler brochure, having a better brochure is one way to do it, but that's only part of it. And part of, you know, simplifying the message is about making it clear and you know, rather than having a 9-page waffly set of information, if you can distill that into 1 or 2 pages that's compelling and has good images, then yes, that's going to be more effective. But there are a few kind of quick and dirty things to look at when we're looking at behaviour change. Another one is Susan Mishy's group over in the UK have the Behaviour Change Wheel, which is a whole book, talks about this stuff. So that's another really great resource as well. But I can send all those links across easy.
Awesome, thank you. I think there might be a lengthy email from you with many resources we'll send. Any final comments, Melissa? And I'll unmute Fern so she can close up. Yeah, any other final?
No, that's all. That's all. Just to, yeah, behaviour change and ecology is a really important interdisciplinary area to kind of put together, and I'm looking forward to seeing my impact of how I can help with the bio plan. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Melissa. Thanks, Melissa. Thanks, Andy, for managing the questions and sorting our tech for us. Thanks to everybody who came along, who asked all those terrific questions. It's so good to hear people asking questions as well, rather than just typing them. It gives us a much better sense of being connected with people in this webinar process. I'm really excited about this work and about the work that ARI will continue to do in this space too. Some of you will know that we're about to appoint a new postdoc in this space as well. So it really helps build our team, and we recognise that this is a really important thing for us to progress in how we support biodiversity in Victoria and beyond. So thanks to all of you. As usual, if the recording has worked, we'll share that to our email distribution list as well. And just thanks once more, and we'll see you, hear you next time. Thanks a lot. Take care. Go and enjoy.